kind of a mini topic, I think, but it's pretty interesting, I think. So this is, if any of you, I'm sure none of you have any experience whatsoever with, the devil's grass, but if you have, many of us have confronted this basic philosophical question, right? Which is like, is my green the same as like your green? Or when I look at green, am I actually perceiving what you see? Would you see red? All that stuff, right? So we've probably all thought about this kind of thing before. This is kind of a classic, even among non-stone old philosophers, right? This is like a kind of classic question. And in a philosophical sense, this is really hard to answer, right? Because there's no way to move your consciousness into someone else's nervous system and know what it feels like for someone else to see red when you see green or whatever. But people are interested in psychology. In the general question, I think of how knowledge and how culture and things like that affect how people perceive colors, right? Whether colors actually look different to different people, or whether people just describe colors differently, that's kind of a classic question that people have asked in this field, right? So people have kind of talked about this in a few different ways that I'll kind of go through a couple of the classic examples of this. So one of the things you can do to test this idea, how do people see kind of color differently, right, is you can ask people, you can show people a bunch of different colors and ask them to name those colors, right? So here's an example of this kind of thing, where if you showed a bunch of people these colors, what these bars are essentially illustrating is what percentage of people said the sort of dominant label for those colors, right? So if you show people this color, everyone says that's black. If you show people this color, everyone says it's white. This would basically be 100% over here. Everyone says that's brown, that's pink, that's orange. Now if you show them this shade, only maybe 80% of people call that peach, maybe 70% of people or whatever call that teal. Other people might have different names for it. And you go on down and so forth, and you get to colors navy, which I would probably just call that blue. This color, some people would say is wine, but I would probably just say is red or purple or something like that, and so on and so forth, right? So what you tend to find, if you study this kind of thing, right, is that there are certain colors that everyone kind of describes in the same color language, at least everyone who speaks English, right? And we call these kind of the basic colors, right? These are kind of your Crayola, crayon box colors, right? These are kind of your basic color names. I think everyone probably has the intuition that these color names are in some sense more fundamental than all these other things. That these are kind of real colors, and these are almost names of shades or something like that, right? So one of the interesting things is that, let's see if let me go back. Yeah, so one of the interesting things is that this is pretty universal in English, right? But one of the weird things is that not all languages have the same number of kind of basic color words, right? So English has a fair number of them. We would consider these all kind of basic colors. But there are other languages that have many fewer words for colors. And some languages actually only have 2 or 3 or 4 words for colors. And one of the interesting things you find is that there are a couple of languages that really only have words for bright and dark, and sort of hot and cold colors, that kind of thing. But if you have languages that have very few color words, one of the interesting things that you find is that those color words tend to be versions of red, green, blue, and yellow are kind of the color words that appear in almost every language. And if you think about that, that kind of makes sense with our nervous system, because our nervous system is based on the red versus green versus blue cones we have, and then on the contrast of red plus green versus blue, which gives us kind of yellow-blue contrast, right? So those, and alongside the basic words for dark and light, or black and white, are kind of the seemingly the most fundamental color words across languages. And then as you add sort of more words for color, different languages will have words for orange and purple, gray, and so forth. So one of the kind of neat things is that even languages that don't have many words for colors, there seems to be some kind of idea that the ones that are sort of fundamental to our nervous system are the ones that tend to be in the languages that don't have as much color vocabulary. But that said, there are languages that have words for colors that we don't have. So a good example is Russian, or all the kind of Slavic languages. So Russian has kind of 2 relatively basic words for color. So I do not speak Russian, but I am told that this kind of darker blue shade here, if you were to buy crayons in Russia, that one would be called something like sini. and this one would be called something like gulaboid, right? So we would probably call those both blue, unless somebody was really pushing you to describe what shade of blue they were. But Russians would kind of call these two different colors, right? So one of these big questions that people have asked is essentially like, does language and like our culture affect how we actually see color, right? So the idea here, so people have asked this a few different ways. We might not get to all these. But in this particular study that I'm showing you kind of at the right here, what happened here? People had to kind of pick which of two colors match the color at the top, right? So I think the left one is actually the match, right? Although it's a pretty tough decision in this case. Now, what's interesting about this particular language study is that, so I think almost everyone can do this with pretty high accuracy if you kind of like get the difficulty level of this right? That everyone can eventually choose that like these two squares match rather than like these two, right? I think that's the case. I'm a little close to it. That looks correct. The interesting thing in this particular study is they did this with like English versus Russian speakers. And what they found is that everyone could do this task. Everyone could kind of pick which of these shades match the kind of target shade up here. But Russian speakers were faster at this if the two choices down here crossed the boundary between what they would call Sini versus Goluboy, right? So, if they were kind of a similar kind of amount of color distance apart, but one of them was kind of on this side of the boundary and one of them was kind of on this side, Russian speakers were actually faster at it than English speakers, right? Even though everyone could do it accurately. That's kind of neat, right? So that sort of suggests that maybe language does affect how we see color, right? Or at least how quickly we can kind of match two colors together. That said, this is one of those things that like scientists have like argued about like for a long, long time. This is another example of a study that has done this kind of thing. So in English, we have, we don't have two different blue words, but we have different words for like blue versus green. So what we find basically is like, if we do a study like this, where we show people this shade, and we ask them, so we show you this and then we take it away, and we ask you then, did you see this or this? Or we show you this, same thing, and we ask you, was it this or this? Most people who speak English will find this to be an easier choice than this, like these match and these match. But most people find this easier than this. And the reason is that, this is kind of the same thing in English speakers, that like, we have different words for blue and green. As it turns out, these colors and these colors are perceptually, like in terms of their actual light characteristics, these are the same kind of difference from each other as these are. But because we have different words for that, like this thing looks green to us and this thing looks like it's on the blue side of things, over here it looks like these are both what most English speakers would call blue, right? So even though this is as different from this in sort of objective color terms or like wavelength terms as this is from this, English speakers tend to find this easier than this, right? So that would again suggest that like language affects memory. Now the tricky thing, that language affects your ability to process color, right? Now the tricky thing is that you can kind of go both ways on this, because this is a task that relies on memory, right? So you like just saw this and then I took it away and you had to make this choice, versus I showed this and I took it away and you had to make this choice. You're relying on your memory of the color, right? So presumably your color memory is, one of the things you're going to do when you're trying to remember this color is either consciously or unconsciously, you're going to label it as like blue or green or whatever. And then when you see this choice, that's going to be hard, right? Because they're both kind of blues, but this might be easier because you remember this is blue, and it wasn't like that green shade, right? But if we instead ask you to like just kind of match this perceptually when you've all got them on the screen, and I don't take this away in the interim, everyone kind of performs equally well on the quote unquote easy versus the hard task, right? So, so accuracy only is affected at this, or like the color boundaries only affect accuracy on this when we're talking about memory, but not when we're talking about pure perception. So, there's been like hundreds of studies on this. This is one of the, like the classic debates in kind of not just color, but like on how language affects how we see and how we think. The basic take-home message is that in some ways, like language seems to affect how quickly we characterize things and how fast we make these judgments and how accurately we can make these judgments if they're based on memory. But if we're just talking about like whether you can tell the difference visually between two colors, that does not seem to be affected by language. That's kind of the short version that kind of combines like hundreds and hundreds of studies into like 2 sentences, right? So At least what this tells us is that language seems to affect color, color memory and maybe like our speed for like categorizing colors, but language does not seem to affect our sort of pure ability to judge whether two things are the same or different while perceiving them. Okay, so I think that's it for today. I'm like 30 seconds over, sorry about that. But that's one chunk of the all seem the same color stuff. We'll pick up the last couple little bits of that next time. And